A Great Argead Saga ALEXEIN, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lochos, The Sacred Band. By Makāula Nakae. Episode 30, Cold Mandate. Winter Mobilization. Early January, 367 BCE, the High Strategy Chamber, Makāula, Thebes. The festive, warm hum of the civic New Year was instantly suffocated, replaced by the clinical, metallic footprint of total mobilization. Across the lower plazas of Thebes, the traditional winter sacrifices were abandoned mid-ritual. The smoke rising from the altars of the Agora was no longer for prosperity, but for retribution. Inside the subterranean war room of the Makāula, the atmosphere was dense, vibrating with a volatile mixture of panic and incandescent rage. Spread across the massive cedar table was a detailed topographical map of Thessaly, its edges pinned down by heavy bronze spear butts. At the head of the grid stood the empty iron stool that Epaminondas had occupied only hours before. The master of Thebes was already gone, driving his vanguard hard up the northern roads toward Thessaly, leaving behind a council room still reeling from the shock of his unilateral decree. Lured into a treacherous parley under a false flag of truce as the previous year closed, General Pelopidas had been violently seized by Alexander of Pherae, and the heart and soul of the sacred band was currently sitting in a suffocating northern dungeon. The tyrant demands a territorial ledger, a senior bodarch hissed, his hand trembling as he slammed a salt-crusted dispatch onto the map. He demands the immediate withdrawal of our garrisons from Larissa and a formal renunciation of our northern alliances in exchange for Pelopidas's life. He believes he has trapped our foreign policy in his dungeon. He has trapped nothing but his own execution. General Pammenes answered from the shadows of the doorway, his voice carrying the cold, absolute certainty of the orders Epaminondas had left behind before riding out into the dawn. Pammenes stepped forward, his eyes tracking the jagged, freezing mountain passes of the Othrys range marked on the parchment. The general knew the tyrant's mind before the ink on this dispatch had even dried. Alexander of Pherae operates under the illusion that winter dictates our logistics. He thinks the snow will buy him until spring to negotiate vectors, but Epaminondas is already moving to shatter that arithmetic. But the architecture of our defense is now dangerously thin. General Lycomedes stepped forward, his brow furrowed with deep strategic anxiety as he looked around the room at the missing commander. The general took the core of our pikes north, but he left the southern gate wide open. The Peloponnese is a bleeding wound. Sparta is regrouping near Phlius, and the Athenian fleet is actively watching our coastal flanks. By marching the main host into the teeth of a winter campaign, we are trading the security of the entire hegemony for a single man. Pelopidas is not one man, Pammenes countered softly, his gaze locking onto Lycomedes with an unblinking, predatory intensity. He is the absolute definition of Theban honor. If a petty despot can violate the sacred laws of diplomacy and hold a pole march of the sacred band without a catastrophic response, then the entire structure of our hegemony is already obsolete. The geometry of our power relies on absolute deterrence. Pammenes struck the map with his fist, his knuckles gripped with bone-straining force against the parchment. The general's command stands absolute, Pammenes declared, carrying the authority of the absent leader. We do not wait for the spring thaw. We do not negotiate terms with a viper. The mobilization he ordered before he crossed the northern frontier is already in motion, and every available hoplite remaining in the Boeotian League will hold the line until the tyrant falls. Piraeus, deep logistics of the Piraeus network. Early January, 367 BCE, the subterranean concourse, Munitia Hill, Piraeus. While the upper city of Athens debated the shifting balance of power in the north, whispering of Epaminondas's furious march toward Thessaly, and the sudden, iron-fisted consolidation of the Macedonian frontier under Perdiccas, the real survival of the Athenian state was being engineered beneath the limestone foundations of Piraeus. The subterranean network of Piraeus was an architectural marvel. A vast, interconnected labyrinth of rock-cut tunnels, dry dock slips, and massive grain vaults designed to feed and mobilize the trireme fleet even under total siege. But January 367 BCE brought an enemy that diplomacy could not bribe and shields could not block: raw, unrelenting dampness and winter sickness. Lysandra moved swiftly through the main junction, where the grain corridors intersected the naval munitions depot, her boots ringing sharp against the dry stone channels. She pulled her heavy wool cloak tighter as a draft of freezing salt air whistled through the ventilation shafts from the outer harbor. The entire geopolitical balance hangs on a thread this winter, Lysandra thought, her dark eyes scanning the stacks of spare pine oars and hemp cordage lining the corridor walls. Thebes is bleeding its strength into the Thessalian snows to recover Pelopidas, and Macedon is slamming its iron gates shut under a new king. If Athens hesitates for even a week, if our naval reserves rot in these damp slips, our fever sweeps our dockyards, we won't just lose our maritime supremacy. We'll be entirely blind to whatever monster rises from the north. A few paces away, Menander stood on a wooden staging platform, directing a squad of engineers who were shoring up a sagging limestone archway with thick pitch-coated pine beams. The sound of heavy mallets striking timber echoed like a rapid heartbeat through the subterranean vault. The rock here is shifting under the frost heave, Menander noted mentally, wiping sweat and stone dust from his eyes despite the freezing temperature. If a section of this main artery collapses, half our trireme reserves will be trapped behind tons of rubble while the fleet is called to station. We are racing against the very mountain we carved out. Menander lowered his hammer and stepped down to meet Lysandra, his breath fogging in the torchlight. The structural reinforcement of the Zia docks is holding, Menander reported, his voice crisp and professional. But the lower slipways near the municipal granaries are drawing seepage from the high tide mark. If the water table rises another foot with these winter storms, the lower tier of grain sacks will spoil before February. Demetrius hurried up from the direction of the newly established subterranean clinic, his arms loaded with fresh bundles of dried medicinal herbs and clean linen bandages. His face was pale with exhaustion, bearing the dark circles of a man who had not slept while tending the growing wave of camp fever. The recruits arriving from the city are too soft for this environment, Demetrius thought, frustration tightening his jaw as he remembered the shivering oarsmen coughing violently in the improvised triage ward. They come down from the warm homes of Attica, spend 12 hours pulling oars in a freezing slipway, and their lungs fill with fluid by midnight. If I don't keep the quarantine absolute, this entire naval base will be crippled from the inside out without a single enemy ship ever leaving port. We've isolated the worst cases in the secondary cistern gallery behind the chalk line, Demetrius said, breathless as he caught up to Lysandra and Menander. We're boiling willow bark and wild thyme around the clock to clear their chests, but the damp is our worst enemy. Without a steady supply of dry charcoal for the brazier pits, the fever is going to jump the quarantine. Lysandra didn't flinch. She absorbed the logistical crisis with the cold, unyielding calculation of a master administrator. There are no easy margins left, Lysandra realized, her gaze steady and resolute as she looked between her two chief officers. The northern world is burning, Thebes is marching into a blizzard, and Piraeus is holding the breath of Athens in its lungs. Take whatever timber you need from the reserve dockyards, Menander, strip the old merchant hulls if the structural beams run short, Lysandra commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Demetrius requisitioned double rations of wine and dry charcoal from the municipal stores for the clinic. No sailor or oarsman dies of lung rot in these tunnels on my watch. She turned back toward the central command table, where maps of the Aegean sea lanes and subterranean grid layouts were pinned beneath heavy iron weights. The winter will break eventually, Lysandra murmured, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the ink lines marking the northern trade routes. And when the ice clears, Athens will not crawl out of these tunnels. We will sail out of them with a fleet that owns the sea. North Gate. Early January 367 BCE, the North Gate, the Cadmea, Thebes. The dawn did not break, it merely dissolved the dark into a freezing slate-gray mist that rolled off the marshes. The wind howling through the open iron framework of the North Gate carried a bitter, wet sleet that coated the stone ramparts in a thin sheen of ice. Philip stood on the high stone outcropping overlooking the departure path, flanked closely by his inner circle, Antigonus, Pethan, Leonidas, and Amyntar. Wrapped tied in a dark wool travel cloak, his 14-year-old face was illuminated by the flickering glare of a guard's torch. His analytical gaze did not track the grandeur of the march. His gray eyes were locked onto the internal mechanics of the Vanguard, studying how the men adjusted their balance on the icy road. how the supply wagons managed the grade, and how Pammenes directed the rotation of the flank guards, now that Epaminondas was already miles ahead on the northern road. There was no celebratory fanfare, no rhythmic cadence of flutes, and no boastful swagger among the ranks. The army moved with the grim, silent velocity of a machine designed for retribution. At the head of the column marched the remaining shock troopers and regional reserves. Their bronze-faced Argead shields were locked in a tight, protective carapace against the driving sleet, their heavy 8-foot ash spears bristling like a moving forest of iron. They moved with a terrifyingly disciplined synchronization, each step a mathematical certainty, driven by a collective silent fury. Behind them, the main body of hoplites ground into motion, their iron-shod boots churning the freezing mud of the road into a gray sludge. Antigonus shifted his weight, his knuckles bleached to a stark ivory where he gripped his spear shaft. They are throwing their weight north into the teeth of a blizzard, Antigonus thought, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the last of the Vanguard. Epaminondas has stripped the capital of its veteran corps. If the Southern Coalition, our domestic faction, moves on the Cadmea today, there is nothing left here but stone walls and boys. They are marching into a meat grinder, Pethan muttered under his breath, a sharp, cynical edge curling the corner of his mouth. Thessaly in January is an executioner's block for an advancing army. The general trades his entire strategic depth just to pry one man out of a tyrant's dungeon. No, Philip murmured, his voice dropping into a vibrant, chillingly mature register as he watched the tail end of the column disappear into the swirling gray mist. Thebes is deploying their maximum mass with absolute velocity. They aren't just launching a rescue mission, Pethan. They are testing the limits of their own architecture. Leonidas stepped forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the heavy iron gates of the citadel behind them. The masters are gone, Leonidas thought, a cold, thrilling calculation pulsing through his veins. The veteran shield is walking away into the snow. The security of the inner gates now falls to us and the cadet watches. Every shift we pull, every perimeter we map while they are away, brings us closer to mastering the levers of the city. Aminter's sharp eyes were scanning the supply carts trundling past the gateway, his mind already calculating the logistics of the depleted garrison. The supply trains are half empty already, Aminter noted mentally, his brow furrowing. If the northern passes freeze shut and the grain from the Boeotian plains stops flowing into the citadel silos, a 2-week siege will starve out the remaining guards before the spring thaw. Pammenes, standing near the command post just inside the gate, turned his weary, battle-hardened gaze toward the group of Macedonian princes. He gave a sharp, definitive nod, delegating the immediate internal security of the citadel to the foreign cadets and hostages. "The gate is yours to secure now, boys," Pammenes called out over the howling wind, his voice strained with the weight of the absent command. "Rotate the watches with the field cadets. Keep the inner bailey locked down until the northern roads open." Philip tightened his grip on his cloak, his eyes flashing with an unyielding, ambitious fire. Let them march north to bleed in the mud. Philip thought, a profound sense of destiny taking root in his mind as he looked back at the empty, echoing courtyards of the Cadmea. They leave us behind to guard their empty house, thinking we are caged. But every day they are gone, we learn how their empire is built and how easily it can be taken apart. Breaking of the mask. Second week January 367 BCE, the private quarters of Prince Philip, Thebes. The first true light of winter broke over the Cadmea, cold and blue, slicing through the narrow casement of the guest residence. Prince Philip stood motionless in the center of the room, stripped to his waist, the sweat from his dawn training still glistening on the raw, expanding muscle of his chest and shoulders. Across the cedar table stood General Pammenes, his heavy wool travel cloak, still dusted with the white frost of the Locrian roads. Gathered closely around the table in the dim, stone-walled chamber were Philip's inner circle. They had been summoned before dawn, their eyes sharp and alert, sensing the seismic shift vibrating through the morning air. Between them lay a single, salt-crusted leather capsule. It had been carried across the Malian Gulf by a courier who had ridden 3 horses to death to outrun the winter gales. Inside was the decoded cipher from Pella. The mask is discarded. Perdiccas has assumed absolute command. The regent's supporters are broken. Philip did not speak. His 14-year-old body remained perfectly still, yet his eyes, gray and analytical, the eyes of an Argead predator, narrowed as the mathematical finality of the news settled into his mind. Antigonus leaned forward over the table, his hands resting flat on the wood, his eyes locked onto the papyrus cipher. Perdiccas didn't just break the regency, he crushed it, Antigonus thought, a sharp, approving thrill racing through him. The northern lords are falling in line. The era of hesitation in Pella is over, and we are no longer hostages of a divided house. We are the brothers of an absolute king. Your brother has rewritten the calculus of the north, Pammenes said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He stepped forward, placing a massive scarred hand on the boy's shoulder. Perdiccas did not merely survive the frontier. He used the scorpions to weld the border lords into a single tactical vanguard. Ptolemy Lochos is isolated in his own tower. The submissive ward is gone, Philip. The Iron King has taken the throne. Pethan let out a dry, sardonic breath, a sharp smile touching the corner of his mouth as he crossed his arms over his chest. The game has changed completely, Pethan thought, looking around the room at his companions. Ptolemy thought he could play us like pawns against the mountain tribes, and now he's trapped in his own tower, waiting for the axe to fall. The Thebans think we're studying their phalanx formations, but our true army just took the crown. So the regency is a corpse, Pethan said aloud, his tone edged with crisp amusement. And the South doesn't even realize yet that the kingdom they thought they had on a leash has just grown teeth. Leonidas stepped closer to the table, his gaze fixed on the decoded seal with a cold, calculating intensity. Every wall we've mapped, every guard rotation we've studied in this citadel has been leading to this moment, Leonidas thought, a dark, ambitious pulse thrumming in his temples. Perdiccas has secured the north, but Philip is sitting right in the heart of the beast. We aren't waiting to be rescued anymore. We are learning how to hollow this empire out from the inside. If Perdiccas holds the mountain passes and the southern engines, Leonidas murmured smoothly, looking up to meet Philip's gaze, then Thebes can no longer treat us as disposable collateral. Their leverage just evaporated. Amyntar's sharp, methodical mind was already racing past the political triumph, calculating the immediate logistical and defensive fallout for their circle. The political shockwave will hit the Theban council before nightfall, Amyntar noted mentally, his brow furrowing as he weighed the risks. Pammenes knows it, and the Boeotarchs will feel it. If the council panics, they might try to lock down the royal quarters or double our guard to keep us from slipping away. The council will see this as a direct threat to their northern hegemony, Amyntar said quietly, stepping forward into the light of the hearth. When they realize Perdiccas isn't going to play by their diplomatic rules, they'll look at us through very different eyes. We need to control the narrative of our own security here in the Cadmea. A profound, clinical smile touched the corner of Philip's mouth, a terrifyingly mature expression of pure intellect. For months, he had sat in the lecture halls of Epaminondas and the wrestling pits of the sacred band, enduring the polite condescension of the Theban pole marches, who viewed him as a useful, decorated hostage. They believed they were tempering a captive lion to serve as a submissive bridge to the north. They did not realize they were providing the ultimate whetstone for a machine that would one day swallow Greece whole. Perdiccas did not wait for the spring thaw, Philip murmured, his voice dropping to a low, vibrant baritone that commanded absolute silence in the room. He walked to the weapon rack, his hand closing over the hilt of his curved Thracian Saga. He drew the cold iron blade, watching the blue morning light slide along its edge. He understood the lesson of Leuctra better than the Thebans themselves. When the enemy's flank is exposed, you do not negotiate vectors. You apply the maximum velocity of the vanguard. Thebes will realize what they have nurtured here, Philip, Pammenes warned gently, his gaze fixed on the young prince, acutely aware of the dangerous friction between his city's ambitions and the rising power before him. The council believes Macedon is a fractured tool to be managed. If they see your brother unifying the northern clans, they will look at you not as a guest, but as the blueprint of their own obsolescence. Let them look, Philip replied, turning toward the window to face the training grounds below, where the elite soldiers of the sacred band were beginning their lethal choreography. His grip tightened on the blade until his fingertips pressed together with draining color. My brother has set the teeth of the frontier. He has closed the internal vulnerabilities that left our house bleeding for a decade. The architecture is set. He looked past the walls of the Cadmea, his gaze locking toward the distant snow-capped peaks of the north, flanked by the 4 young men who shared his exile and his destiny. The mathematics of power had shifted irrevocably. His brother had broken the mask of submission in Pella, and here in the south, the young cub was finishing his calculation. Philip was no longer just a student copying the weapons of his masters. He was the architect waiting for his turn to shake the world. Attrition of winter. Mid-January 367 BCE, Theban forward operating base, northern Othries slopes. The physical landscape of Thessaly had become an active combatant. Perched on a jagged, wind-swept ridge overlooking the Pagasetic basin, the Theban forward operating base was a grim geometric scar of timber and frozen earth. A relentless horizontal sleet slammed against the leather command tents, instantly freezing into a brittle armor of ice over the baggage wagons and piled shields. Inside the perimeter, there was no warmth. The Boeotian hoplites did not huddle around open fires. Epaminondas had banned large blazes to deny Alexander ferry scouts any metric of their numbers. Instead, the men stood in disciplined, rotating sentry shifts, their fingers stiffening around the shafts of their ash pikes, their breath joining the gray, oppressive fog that swallowed the mountains. The campaign had entered a phase of raw physical attrition, where victory was measured not in blood, but in the structural endurance of the logistics strain. Inside the central command tent, the canvas snapped violently against its oak support posts, vibrating with the force of the mountain gale. A single oil-soaked torch fought a losing battle against the damp gloom, casting flickering, distorted shadows across a map weighed down by heavy bronze stones. Epaminondas stood motionless beside the table, his cloak dark with frozen sleet, his eyes fixed on the narrow mountain pass leading down into Ferry. He had not slept in 36 hours. The frost is a sharper blade than any Thessalian spear, Epaminondas thought, his mind calculating the silent drain on their supply lines. If the mule trains from Boeotia cannot clear the Othries passes before the next blizzard seals the gorges, hunger will break this phalanx before we ever sight the tyrant's walls. Alexander knows this. He sits warm behind his stone battlements, betting that the winter will do his fighting for him. A heavy footstep broke the canvas flap, and a senior chiliarch stepped inside, shedding a cascade of ice crystals from his helmet. His face was weathered raw by the wind, his breath pluming wide in the chill air. The latest dispatch from the rear guard just arrived, General, the chiliarch said, his voice gravelly and exhausted as he laid a damp, salt-stained scrap of parchment on the table. The snow has drifted 6 feet deep across the northern approaches. 2 supply wagons flipped into the ravine near Lamia. We've lost our reserve grain rations for the 3rd cohort, and the frostbite cases are multiplying among the younger levies. Epaminondas didn't look up from the map. His hand reached out slowly, his fingers, stiff with cold, tracing the ink-drawn contours of the enemy territory. Every mile of mud we cross costs a drop of blood, Epaminondas thought, feeling the immense weight of the men who trusted him with their lives. Yet if we pull back now, if we let the cold defeat us, Pelopidas rots in the dark and the Theban hegemony shatters like brittle glass. We cannot retreat. We must become harder than the winter itself. Send the engineering corps back to clear the pass with iron picks and timber supports, Epaminondas commanded, his voice steady, absolute, and devoid of panic. Double the draft animal rations from the central stores. Not a single company falls back. If the mountain blocks our road, we will carve a new one through the ice. The chiliarch stared at the general for a long moment, seeing the terrifying, unyielding resolve that held the entire army together against the elements. He's made of the same stone as the mountains, the chiliarch thought, offering a sharp, grim nod. He will drive this army through the gates of hell if the geometry of war demands it. At once, General, the commander muttered, turning back into the howling storm to rally the frozen lines. Alone once more in the snapping canvas tent, Epaminondas picked up his bronze stylus, his gaze fixed on the fortress of Ferry, lurking in the freezing fog below. The war had moved beyond politics and tactics. It was now a test of human endurance, and the winner would soon discover who was truly unbreakable. Tyrant Scriptorium. Mid-January 367 BCE, fortified winter camp outside Ferry. Concurrently, 30 miles to the north, the internal mechanics of Alexander of Ferry's military apparatus were beginning to fray. Inside the tyrant's fortified winter camp, The damp chill had penetrated the very bone of his army. Unlike the disciplined silence of the Theban lines, the Thessalian tents were dense with a toxic, simmering panic. Alexander's forces, largely comprised of unwilling conscripts, torn from the plains, and brutal mercenaries, whose loyalty was pegged strictly to the weight of silver, were entirely unsuited for a seasonal war of endurance. The rumors filtering through the mountain passes had become a psychological vanguard, weaponized by Epaminondas' calculated pace. The scouts brought back terrifying, synchronized data. The Theban main host was not stalling in the snow. They were advancing with a flat mathematical certainty, clearing the high ridges in full battle order despite the sleet. Alexander paced the length of his cedar-paneled scriptorium, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his boots violently kicking away a pile of useless reconnaissance maps that scattered across the mosaic floor. His audacious capture of Pelopidas had seemed like a flawless strategic leverage point months ago. But now, looking at the rapidly degrading morale of his shivering, nervous troops through the narrow arrow slit, the true, crushing cost of his treachery was becoming clear. I thought I had caged a lion, Alexander thought, his chest heaving as a cold sweat broke out across his neck, despite the biting chill in the room. I thought holding a pole march of the sacred band would paralyze their political will. Instead, I have dragged an entire avalanche down upon my own head. The heavy oak door of the scriptorium creaked open, and Polyphron, his chief mercenary captain, stepped inside, his armor clanking loosely against a frame thinned by days of nervous tension. "The latest reports from the southern ridge just came in, my lord," Polyphron said, his voice tight and uneven. "The Vanguard has cleared the Othries Pass." They didn't wait for the ice to melt. They cut a road through the rock with iron picks and timber shores. They are less than a day's march from the outer perimeter. Alexander spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, his fingers curling into tight, trembling fists. They are moving faster than the frost can stop them, Alexander thought, panic clawing at his throat. My mercenaries are already murmuring about betrayal in the taverns. If the Thebans hit these walls with full phalanx weight, my own men will open the gates just to save their own skins. "Cut them off," Alexander snarled, his voice cracking with rising hysteria as he stepped toward the captain. "Send every cavalry unit we have into the gorges. Burn the villages, flood the roads, make the terrain an impassable bog." "We cannot," Polyphron replied flatly, his eyes meeting the tyrant's with a cold, unforgiving reality. "The horses are foundering in the mud, and the men refuse to march into a blizzard against an enemy that doesn't even feel the cold. They didn't sign up to fight a mountain, Alexander. They signed up for plunder." Alexander lunged forward, grabbing the front of Polyphron's leather jerkin and slamming him against the stone wall with a hollow thud. "I am the master of Faerie," Alexander hissed into the captain's face, spittle flying from his lips. "They obey me, or I will string every deserter from the battlements until the crows pick their bones clean." Polyphron didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the tyrant's white-knuckled grip with a quiet, devastating contempt. "He's cracking," Polyphron thought, a grim realization settling over him. "He sits in his warm scriptorium, screaming at shadows, while the real king of Greece marches through the snow to collect his debt." "You can threaten us all you want, Alexander," Polyphron said softly, prying the tyrant's fingers away from his chest with cold, methodical strength. "But you cannot execute an army that is already packing its gear. Decide whether you are going to face them on the field, or if we are cutting our own terms before the sun clears the ridge." Polyphron turned and walked out of the room, leaving the heavy oak door swinging open into the drafty corridor. Left alone in the suffocating silence of the scriptorium, Alexander sank slowly into his high-backed chair. He stared down at the empty dungeon keys resting on the mahogany desk, the keys to the cell that now held a man he dared neither kill nor release. The trap had snapped shut, but it was the hunter, not the lion, who was caught inside. Epaminondas' command tent, Theban line, near Pharsalus. The frozen canvas of the command tent snapped violently in the morning gale, the icy fabric groaning under the pressure of the mountain winds as a senior bodark, his face pale with indignation and caked with road salt, stepped inside. He did not bother to shake the sleet from his heavy woolen cloak. With a sharp, rigid movement, he laid a heavy, wax-sealed leather portfolio onto the central map table, directly before Epaminondas. "Envoys from Faerie cleared our forward picket an hour ago," under a flag of truce, the Boadark reported, his voice tight with a mixture of disgust and residual exhaustion from the freezing night watch. The tyrant demands a formal ledger of terms. He offers the immediate release of Pelopidas and Ismenias, but the price is absolute. Thebes must renounce all northern alliances, withdraw our garrisons from Larissa, and pay a ransom of 50 talents of silver. He dares to use our own general as leverage to dictate the foreign policy of the League. 50 talents and the surrender of our northern architecture, the Boadark thought bitterly, his fists clenching at his sides. He sits behind stone walls while our men freeze in the mud, yet he imagines he can dictate the terms of the hegemony with a stroke of a pen. Epaminondas did not lean forward to inspect the document. He remained perfectly still, sitting on a plain wooden campaign stool, his hands resting flat on his knees. His customary calm had hardened into a cold, incandescent glare that seemed to drop the temperature within the small tent, freezing the breath of every officer present. He thinks he has captured a hostage, Epaminondas thought, his mind racing through the geometric calculations of power, diplomacy, and blood. He does not understand that by touching Pelopidas, he has broken the fundamental laws that govern our world. A beast that bites the hand of civilization must be put down, not bargained with. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long, sharp shadow over the map of Thessaly. With a single, dismissive flick of his fingers, he struck the tyrant's ledger off the table, letting the wax portfolio tumble unheeded into the freezing mud at his feet. He demands terms? Epaminondas murmured, his voice a low, lethal baritone that cut cleanly through the howling wind outside. Alexander Ferry operates under the delusion that he is a sovereign negotiating vectors of power from a position of strength. He does not realize he is already an obsolete asset. A senior chiliarch, standing near the tent's central support pole, shifted his weight, his eyes gleaming with dark approval at the general's absolute refusal to bend. There can be no middle ground now, the chiliarch thought, watching the cold fire in Epaminondas's gray eyes. If we show hesitation here, every petty tyrant from the Peloponnese to Thrace will believe the Theban pikes can be bluffed by a dungeon door. Epaminondas stepped closer to the Boadark, his gaze locking onto the officer with an unyielding, predatory intensity. Return to his envoys, Epaminondas commanded, his tone absolute. Tell them that Thebes does not calculate the value of its honor in silver, nor do we alter our strategic architecture at the whim of a petty thief. There is no negotiation. There is only the immediate, unconditional release of Pelopidas and Ismenias unharmed. If they are not delivered to my vanguard before the next moon, I will cease these indirect maneuvers. He turned away, walking to the edge of the tent flap, and pushing it back just an inch to look out toward the dark, jagged horizon, where Ferry lay hidden behind the swirling wall of the storm. Hold on a little longer, my brother, Epaminondas whispered silently into the freezing air, the thought burning quietly beneath his iron composure. The machinery of state is moving, and nothing on this earth will save the man who caged you. Tell the tyrant that, if my general bleeds, the calculus changes, Epaminondas said aloud, his words vibrating with an icy authority that silenced every officer in the room. I will march the entire mass of the sacred band directly over his walls. I will dismantle his lineage, scatter his mercenaries, and leave nothing but a field of gray ashes where his tyranny once stood. The ledger is closed. Tell him to choose his grave. To be continued in episode 31, Macedonia, King's Revelation. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Hieros Lochos, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.